A courtyard in Galilee, just after sunrise. A woman stands with her hands open in front of her. Her husband places into them a small square of parchment, written out by a scribe the night before, and the whole document comes down to one clause near the bottom. You are hereby permitted to any man. That sentence is her ruin and her rescue in the same breath. It ends her home. It also ends her legal suspension, because without that parchment she cannot remarry, cannot be provided for, cannot begin anything. She is neither wife nor widow. She is nothing the law has a category for. Documents almost exactly like that one have been pulled out of caves in the Judean desert, written within living memory of Jesus. The wording is strikingly consistent across centuries and across cultures. A husband dismisses, a wife is released, a community keeps the receipt. And when the Pharisees come to Jesus in Matthew 19, that parchment is what they want to talk about. Not love, not covenant, not what marriage is for. They want to talk about the paperwork. The question they ask has been flattened in English translation into something almost meaningless. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Of course it was lawful. Nobody in first century Judaism doubted that. Even the strictest sects allowed it. But Matthew preserves 3 extra words that change the whole encounter. For any cause. That phrase is not a throwaway. It is a legal term of art, the first century equivalent of asking a judge about no-fault filing. Here is the claim this whole video rests on, and I want it in your hands before we go any further. Jesus was asked a question about the rules, and he answered a question about the thing the rules were written to protect. The Church has spent 2,000 years converting his answer back into rules. And in doing that, every single tradition ended up building a door out of a broken marriage. They differ almost entirely in what they agree to call it. Catholics call it annulment. Orthodox call it oikonomia. Protestants call it the exception clause. Nobody anywhere in any century has actually held the line they claim to hold. The honest question is not whether your church has a door, it is whether your church admits it. Start with the flaw underneath all of this, because if you get the Hebrew scriptures wrong here, everything downstream tilts. Almost every argument about biblical divorce eventually lands on Deuteronomy 24 verse 1-4. It gets quoted as the law of divorce, the permission slip, the moment God legislated a way out. That reading is wrong, and the reason is grammatical rather than theological. Hebrew case law works by conditions followed by a ruling. If this happens, and then this, and then this, then here is what you must do. Scholars call the setup the protesis, and the ruling the apodosis. Only the ruling carries legal force. In Deuteronomy 24, verses 1-3 are all set up. A man dismisses his wife. She marries again, the second marriage ends, either by divorce or by death. 3 conditions stacked one on top of another. The actual command does not arrive until verse 4, and it has nothing to do with permission. It forbids the first husband from taking her back after she has been with another man. That is the law. Everything before it is scenery. Which means Moses never authorized divorce. He regulated the wreckage of it. The certificate mentioned in verse 1 is not commanded either. It is described the way a modern statute might mention a lease without endorsing landlords. The phrase describing the grounds is where the entire later argument begins. Ervat davar. 2 Hebrew words that ought to be simple and are not. Erva means nakedness, exposure, shame, the thing you cover. Davar means word, matter, thing. Nakedness of a thing. Indecency of a matter, something shameful about her. Nobody knows precisely what it meant, and the honest scholarly position is that the ambiguity is original rather than accidental. Deuteronomy is being vague on purpose, or was already vague to its earliest readers. That vagueness is a loaded weapon lying on a table for 1,000 years, and eventually 2 rabbis pick it up. Hillel and Shammai were the great rival teachers of Jewish law in the generation just before Jesus, and their schools shaped Judaism for centuries afterward. The Mishnah records their dispute over Deuteronomy 24 verse 1 with almost comic clarity. The house of Shammai read ervat davar as sexual indecency, something serious, something that had actually violated the marriage. The house of Hillel read the 2 words separately. If Moses had meant only indecency, he would have said indecency. The extra word must widen the grounds, so a man could divorce his wife for a matter, any matter, including, in the famous example, burning his dinner. A later rabbi, Akiva, pushed it further still. If a man found a woman more beautiful than his wife, that also counted. I want to be careful here, because this contrast has been oversimplified in 1,000 sermons. There is evidence that Shammai's school also permitted divorce for various breaches of modesty, so the neat picture of one strict school and one lax school is a caricature. Treat the split as a real dispute with fuzzy edges rather than 2 clean positions, but the practical outcome is not in dispute. Hillel's reading won the culture. A phrase entered the legal vocabulary, a divorce for any cause, and it functioned exactly the way no-fault divorce functions now: fast, cheap, and available on demand to husbands only. That is the phrase the Pharisees carried to Jesus. They are not asking whether divorce is permitted, they are asking him to pick a side in a live rabbinic fight, in a district governed by a man who had recently taken his brother's wife and beheaded the prophet who objected. The question is a trap with two jaws. Side with Hillel, and he endorses the culture of disposable wives. Side with Shammai, and he condemns Herod Antipas, and John the Baptist's severed head is the precedent for what happens next. Jesus does something with that question that almost nobody imitates. He refuses the frame entirely. He does not go to Deuteronomy, he goes to Genesis. Male and female he created them. A man leaves his father and mother, clings to his wife, and the two become one flesh. Then the line that detonates the conversation. What God has joined together, let no one separate. Notice what has happened. They asked a question about the exit. He answered with a description of the structure. Here is the analogy I keep returning to on this subject. A mason working on a wall does not measure with a ruler. He drops a plumb line, a weighted string, that hangs dead straight because gravity is not negotiable. A plumb line does not tell you how far you may lean before the wall falls. It tells you what vertical is. Ask a plumb line for a tolerance and it has nothing to say, because that is not what it is for. Jesus dropped a plumb line into a room full of men holding rulers, and the entire history of Christian teaching on divorce is the history of the church picking the plumb line back up and trying to measure permitted degrees of lean with it. The Pharisees pushed back immediately. Why then did Moses command a certificate? Watch Jesus correct the verb. Moses permitted, he says, not commanded, and he permitted it because of the hardness of your hearts. From the beginning, it was not so. That is a stunning thing to say about a text in the Torah. He classifies part of the law as concession rather than intention. He is telling them that some legislation exists to limit damage, not to describe the good. And then in Matthew alone comes the clause that has divided Christendom. Whoever divorces his wife, except for porneia, and marries another, commits adultery. 6 words in Greek. An entire denominational map grows out of them. The first thing to notice is that this exception is missing everywhere else. Mark 10 has no exception. Luke 16 verse 18 has no exception. Paul, writing to Corinth before any gospel was finished, gives no exception of this kind either. Only Matthew has it, and Matthew has it twice, at 5:32 and at 19-9. That asymmetry is a genuine problem, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Some scholars conclude Matthew added the clause to soften an impossible saying for a Jewish Christian congregation. Others conclude Mark and Luke compressed a longer exchange because their readers already assumed adultery ended a marriage. My own position stated plainly so you can disagree with it. The exception clause is original to Jesus, and the shorter versions are summaries. Mark and Luke both report the conversation without the Pharisees' opening phrase about any cause. If you drop the legal question, you drop the legal answer with it. But that only opens the harder problem. What does porneia mean? Greek had a perfectly good word for adultery, moikia. It appears in the same sentence. Jesus says the remarrying man commits moikia, but the exception is granted for porneia, and those are not the same word. Porneia is broader. It covers a whole family of sexual wrongdoing, and its root is connected to prostitution and to selling. In Acts 15, the apostles forbid it to Gentile converts alongside blood and strangled meat, which suggests a category tied to Leviticus rather than a synonym for infidelity. 5 serious readings have grown out of that ambiguity, and I want you to see all 5, because your church almost certainly teaches one of them as though the other 4 do not exist. Reading 1. Porneia means marital unfaithfulness. The divorce is permitted, the bond is broken, the innocent party may remarry. This is the standard Protestant position, and we will come back to who invented it. Reading 2. Porneia means an incestuous or otherwise unlawful union. Paul uses the word this way in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 1, for a man living with his stepmother, a relationship forbidden in Leviticus 18. On this reading, Jesus is not permitting divorce at all. He is saying that some unions were never marriages and must be ended. Reading 3, sometimes called the betrothal view. Jewish engagement was legally binding and required a divorce to break, which is why Matthew 1 verse 19 says, Joseph planned to divorce Mary quietly. On this reading, the exception covers unchastity discovered during betrothal only. Reading 4 is subtler and worth sitting with. The Greek can be read as setting the subject aside rather than carving an exception. Whoever divorces his wife, leaving the question of unchastity out of it, and marries another, commits adultery. Jesus declines to enter the rabbinic argument at all. Reading 5 splits the sentence. Divorce is permitted for porneia. Remarriage is not permitted for anything. Separation without dissolution. This was the dominant Western reading for over 1,000 years. Now watch the disciples, because their reaction is the best evidence we have about how radical this sounded. If that is the situation, they say, it is better not to marry. That response makes no sense if Jesus had merely endorsed Shammai. They lived in a world where both schools permitted divorce and remarriage. Nobody recoils in horror at a familiar legal opinion. Whatever Jesus said, it landed as something new, and something hard, and his reply is not a clarification. He talks about those who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom, and says let the one who can accept this, accept it. The escape valve he offers is not a better rule. It is celibacy. Paul inherits this teaching about 20 years later, and immediately runs into a situation Jesus never addressed, which tells us something important about how the earliest church handled the words of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 7, he distinguishes his sources with unusual care. To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. Then a few verses later, to the rest I say, I, and not the Lord. Paul knows exactly which parts are dominical tradition and which are his own apostolic judgment, and he labels them. The situation is a mixed marriage where one spouse has converted. If the unbeliever leaves, Paul says, let them leave. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to peace. Everything hangs on that phrase, not bound, and the Greek is more interesting than the English. Paul writes, o dedoulotai, from dolu, the verb for enslaving. He does not write dio, the ordinary verb for binding. He uses dio elsewhere in the same chapter. A wife is bound, ddti, to her husband as long as he lives. Same subject, same letter, different verb. That switch is either the most important word choice in the chapter or a coincidence. And I do not think Paul was careless with vocabulary in a passage this carefully sourced. The abandoned believer is not enslaved to a marriage the other party has walked out of. Whether that frees them to remarry is exactly what the church has never agreed on. Paul does not say. He addresses the pastoral panic in front of him and moves on to the next question, leaving a gap that canon lawyers would spend 15 centuries filling. They filled it thoroughly. That passage became the Pauline privilege in Catholic canon law, one of the very few laws in the modern code lifted almost verbatim out of Scripture, and it permits the dissolution of a real marriage between two unbaptized people when one converts and the other refuses to live in peace. Read that again. Rome dissolves marriages. It has a legal procedure for it. Hold that thought. Now the Church Fathers were the received story is much messier than either side of the modern argument admits. The standard Catholic account is that the early Church was unanimous against remarriage after divorce. The standard Protestant account is that the Fathers allowed it for adultery, and Rome hardened later. Both accounts are selective. The Shepherd of Hermas, a Roman text from the 2nd century, says a man must dismiss an adulterous wife, but must not remarry. Precisely so. That she can repent and return. Divorce yes, remarriage no. Reading 5. 300 years before anyone called it that. Basil of Caesarea, bishop from 370, until his death in 379, wrote canonical letters to a fellow bishop that survive as some of the most detailed pastoral law we have from the period. Basil says something that should make everybody uncomfortable. The Lord's rule is equal for men and women, he writes, but custom is not. A man deserted by his wife may take another. A wife deserted by her husband may not. He knows the double standard is not biblical. He records it anyway as the practice of the church he serves. That single admission tells you more about how doctrine actually develops than any amount of theorizing. The anonymous 4th century Latin commentator known as Ambrosiaster went further, permitting a Christian man to remarry after dismissing an adulterous wife, and he appears to be the first writer to teach the Pauline privilege explicitly. He also applies the permission to men and not to women. Augustine, writing around the year 413, is the most interesting witness of all, because he is the one everybody claims. He concluded against remarriage, but he also admitted in writing that Scripture is not clear on the point, and he called it an obscure question. Augustine's uncertainty hardened into Western certainty within a few generations. That is worth noticing. The most influential theologian in Latin Christianity said he was not sure, and the tradition built on him said it was settled. Meanwhile, the East was heading somewhere entirely different, and the reason is not primarily theological, it is administrative. Byzantine emperors governed a Christian empire that had inherited Roman divorce law, and Roman law permitted divorce on multiple grounds. The church in Constantinople was not a separate society, it was woven into imperial administration. Then comes the hinge. Around the year 895, Emperor Leo VI issued legislation making the church ceremony necessary for a legally valid marriage. Before that, marriage had been essentially a civil contract that Christians also had blessed. Think about what that does. The moment the church becomes the registrar of every marriage, it inherits the state's entire divorce docket. Priests who previously offered pastoral counsel are now processing legal dissolutions because somebody has to. The Orthodox theologian John Meyendorff described this with real candor, acknowledging that the church was obliged to bless marriages it did not approve of, and to dissolve them as well, and that it paid for its new social responsibility by largely abandoning its penitential discipline. Out of that pressure came the principle the East is known for: oikonomia. The word means household management, from oikos, house, and nomos, law. A steward, running an estate, does not apply every rule identically to every situation. He manages towards the health of the house. Applied to marriage, oikonomia means the church may recognize that a marriage has died and permit a second one, not as a right and not as a celebration, but as a concession to human weakness. The right for a second marriage is penitential in tone. There are limits, and they came from an emperor's own scandal. Leo VI married 4 times, which caused a crisis so severe that in the year 920, a council issued a decree restricting third marriages and forbidding fourth ones outright. That rule stands in Orthodoxy to this day. Now, my second stated opinion, and Orthodox viewers will not enjoy it. The oikonomia tradition did not grow primarily out of Matthew 19. It grew out of the practical impossibility of running a Christian empire with a rule nobody could enforce, and the exception clause was recruited afterwards to justify what was already happening. That is not automatically a criticism. Reality shapes pastoral practice everywhere. But the East should not pretend its practice is a straight reading of the Gospels, and the West should not pretend its own history is any cleaner. Which brings us to the West's own solution. Rome went the opposite direction and arrived, functionally, at a similar place by a different road. If a valid, sacramental, consummated marriage cannot be dissolved by anything but death, the only remaining question a tribunal can ask is whether the marriage was ever valid in the first place. That is what annulment is. Not the ending of a marriage, but a legal finding that one never existed. Here is my analogy for it. 2 people watch a house burn down. One of them says the house is gone. The other says, on close inspection of the original planning permission, this house was never lawfully built, and therefore nothing has been lost. The second statement may be technically correct. The family standing on the lawn is still homeless. Grounds for nullity are real and often serious. Lack of consent, coercion, concealment of impotence or infertility or a prior marriage, a psychological incapacity to undertake the obligations of marriage, which is by far the most commonly used ground, and the most elastic. The numbers tell a story that theology alone does not. Nullity filings in the United States ran to over 72,000 in the year 1989, and fell to under 23,000 by 2015, tracking Catholic marriage rates rather than any change in doctrine. Pope Francis reformed the procedure in 2015 with the document Mitis Iudex Dominus Essus, removing the requirement of automatic appeal, creating an abbreviated process that can conclude in as few as 120 days, and urging that the process be free. And alongside annulment sit the dissolutions, which are less discussed and more revealing. Rome dissolves a valid but unconsummated marriage. Rome dissolves natural marriages under the Pauline privilege. Rome dissolves them under the Petrine privilege, in favor of the faith by papal act. So the absolute indissolubility that Catholic teaching defends applies to one specific category, a sacramental marriage between 2 baptized persons which has been consummated. Every other marriage on earth is, under the right circumstances, dissoluble by the Church. This is my third opinion, and it is the one I most want to be argued with about. The Catholic system is not more rigorous than the Orthodox one. It is more procedural. It arrives at similar outcomes through a court instead of a confessional. And it requires the petitioner to describe their marriage as a failure of consent rather than a failure of love. That has a cost, and the cost falls on the honest. A person willing to say the marriage was real but is dead has no path. A person willing to reframe the whole history as defective from day one does. The formal Catholic position was set at the Council of Trent, and even that has a hidden seam in it. Canon 7 of the 24th session, promulgated in 1563, anathematizes anyone who says the Church errs in teaching that the marriage bond cannot be dissolved by adultery, and that neither party, including the innocent one, may remarry while the other lives. But look closely at how it is worded. It condemns the claim that the Church errs. It does not directly condemn the practice of remarriage itself. That formulation was chosen deliberately and late. The reason is political. Venice governed territories where Greek Christians followed Orthodox practice without interference, and a direct anathema would have struck those communities as well as the Protestants. A proposal for the indirect wording came from the Venetians in August of 1563 and carried. Whether that leaves any theological room for the Orthodox practice is fiercely disputed. Some scholars argue the council deliberately declined to condemn the Greeks. Others argue that only 17 bishops ever objected on Greek grounds, and the doctrine is unambiguous. Label that one unsettled and treat anyone who states it flatly with suspicion. Now the Protestant story, which contains the single most surprising fact in this entire subject. The standard Protestant position on divorce was not invented by a Protestant. It was invented by a Catholic priest who died in communion with Rome. Desiderius Erasmus, born in 1466 and dead in 1536, published his annotations on 1 Corinthians in 1519. In them he argued that a marriage is dissolved not only by death, but by grave sexual sin, and that the innocent party may therefore marry again. Scholars call this the Erasmian view. It was adopted by Luther, refined by Calvin, and written into the Westminster Confession in the 1640s, which added desertion alongside adultery as a second ground. From there it flowed into virtually every English-speaking Protestant denomination. There was a saying in the period that Erasmus laid the egg and Luther hatched it. On this subject it is close to literally true. The reformers were not unanimous. Some, including Zwingli, Bullinger and Bucer, went considerably further than Erasmus and permitted divorce for reasons ranging from mental incapacity to mutual consent. Beza was among the strictest. The Protestant tradition was plural from the start, but the shape that stuck is the one most evangelical churches still teach: two grounds, adultery and desertion, both of which permit remarriage. And here is the uncomfortable question that the Erasmian view has never fully answered. If the historic reading was wrong for 1500 years, what exactly was rediscovered in 1519? Erasmus had no manuscripts nobody else had seen. He had a humanist's willingness to read the text apart from the tradition, which is a real virtue, and also a real risk. The English story took a different route again, and it is worth telling because it shows how quickly a church can lose control of its own doctrine. Before 1857, English divorce was handled by ecclesiastical courts, which could grant separation but not dissolution. To actually end a marriage, you needed a private act of Parliament, and between 1670 and 1857, only about 317 were passed. Divorce was, in practice, a privilege of the rich. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 moved matrimonial cases from church courts to a new civil court and made divorce available on grounds of adultery, with a double standard written into the statute. A husband needed only adultery, a wife needed adultery plus cruelty or desertion. The church did not simply object to the arrival of civil divorce. It lost jurisdiction over marriage in a single parliamentary session, and it has been negotiating with the results ever since. For most of the 20th century, the Church of England discouraged clergy from remarrying divorced persons. That changed in 2002, when the General Synod voted by 269 to 83 to permit remarriage in church in exceptional circumstances, and later, that year rescinded the older resolutions that had exhorted clergy not to. Clergy retain the right to refuse, which means, in the Church of England, the answer to whether a divorced person may marry in church depends significantly on which parish they walk into. Before we come back to the beginning, one more thread, because it is the most pastorally urgent part of this and the most recently contested. For most of church history, physical abuse was not treated as grounds for divorce. Cruelty could justify separation from bed and board, but the bond stood, and the abused spouse was told to endure and pray. That began to shift seriously within evangelicalism only in the last few decades, and the argument that carried it was structural rather than sentimental. If desertion frees the abandoned party, then a spouse whose violence makes the household unsurvivable has effectively deserted it while still living in the house. Constructive desertion, the argument runs, the abuser has ended the marriage, the divorce is merely the paperwork acknowledging what already happened. In 2019, Wayne Grudem, a theologian whose published position had been the strict two-grounds view as recently as the previous year, announced at a scholarly meeting that he had changed his mind after learning of specific cases of prolonged battering and degradation among people whose theology kept them in the home. Here is my fourth opinion, and I hold it with more conviction than any other in this video. That change should have happened 17 centuries earlier, and the reason it did not is precisely the error I described at the beginning. If you read Jesus as issuing a statute, then the grounds are a closed list, and abuse is not on it. If you read him as dropping a plumb line about what marriage is, then a union that has become a mechanism of terror has already stopped being the thing he was describing, and no list is needed to see it. The rulers produced cruelty, the plumb line would not have. While we are retiring bad arguments, retire this one too. God hates divorce, quoted from Malachi 2 verse 16, is used constantly and rests on a translation that is at best uncertain. The Hebrew verb sein, to hate, is third-person masculine singular in that verse. He hates. When God speaks in the first person in this same book, at Malachi 1 verse 3, the grammar is visibly different. Several major modern translations now render the verse as a condemnation of the man who hates his wife and divorces her, covering his garment with violence. The reversal matters enormously. On the older reading, God hates the act of divorce. On the newer reading, God condemns the man who discards a wife he has stopped loving. One indicts the exit, the other indicts the treachery that made the exit necessary. Given that the surrounding passage is about men divorcing faithful wives to marry foreign women, the second reading fits the context considerably better. Use the verse against betrayal, not against the betrayed, and note that Scripture itself is not simple here. Ezra 9 and 10 record a mass divorce of foreign wives that the text presents as obedience. Jeremiah 3 verse 8 pictures God himself issuing Israel a certificate of divorce. The Bible does not treat divorce as a single, uniform category of sin. So where does all of this leave us? 4 texts in the Gospels that do not obviously agree. 1 Greek word with 5 defensible meanings. An apostle who carefully flagged where he was improvising. Fathers who contradicted each other. An empire that made the church its registrar. A council that chose its wording to avoid a diplomatic incident. A Dutch humanist who changed Protestantism with a footnote. And underneath all of it, one man in Galilee who was asked about the paperwork and talked about the beginning of the world instead. I said at the start that every tradition in Christian history has built a door out of a broken marriage, and that they differ almost entirely in what they agree to call it. You have now seen every one of those doors. Rome calls it nullity and privilege and dissolution in favor of the faith. Constantinople calls it oikonomia and marks it with penitence. Geneva and Canterbury and every evangelical church you have ever attended call it the exception clause and add desertion, and increasingly add abuse. Not one of these traditions has done what Jesus did, which was to answer a question about the exit by describing the structure. I am not going to pretend that is a failure. A church that only ever drops plumb lines and never gives rulings abandons the woman in the courtyard to whatever her husband decides. Someone has to say what happens on Monday morning. That is what pastoral law is for. The failure is not having doors. The failure is calling them something they are not, so that the person walking through has to lie about their own history to be allowed through. Zoom out as far as this goes. 2,000 years from that courtyard, across every continent, in languages nobody in Galilee had heard of, the church is still arguing about a parchment the size of a hand. And the reason the argument will not resolve is that Jesus refused to end it. He was handed a rule and he returned a description of what human beings are for. And descriptions of that kind do not settle cases, they haunt them. Which leaves you, if you are carrying a divorce in your history, or watching someone you love carry one, with a question that no denomination can answer on your behalf. Not whether the door you walked through was correctly labeled, but whether you are still capable of believing that the thing described in Genesis is real and good and was never meant to be a cage. The certificate said you are hereby permitted to any man. It was in its own brutal way a mercy. It let a woman with no other protection begin again. Grace does something the certificate could not. It does not merely permit you to begin, it goes back to the ruin and refuses to call it the last word. If this landed on you, or on someone you have watched be quietly excluded from communion, or from a wedding, or from the assumption that they are welcome, send it to them. That conversation almost never happens out loud, and it should.